Mark Thompson was an ordinary man, living an unassuming life in the small, quiet town of Riverbend. As a mechanic, he found joy in fixing things, broken engines, rusted gearboxes, and even the occasional junkyard car brought back to life. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment when a routine purchase turned his world upside down. It was a crisp autumn morning when Mark decided to visit the local used car lot. The lot, a haphazard collection of vehicles of varying conditions, was run by an old-timer named Joe. Joe was known for giving fair deals, and Mark trusted him. Mark wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a fixer-upper he could tinker with in his spare time. That's when his eyes fell on an old, battered sedan tucked away in the farthest corner of the lot. The car was nondescript, its once vibrant blue paint faded to a dull grayish hue. Something about it, though, piqued Mark's curiosity. "This one's been here for years," Joe said, noticing Mark's interest. "A lot of folks passed on it. Can't tell you much about its history, but it's solid if you're willing to put in the work." Mark inspected the car closely. The interior smelled of mildew, and the seats were torn, but the engine had potential. After a brief negotiation, Mark handed over a modest sum and drove the car home, its rattling frame barely holding together. He couldn't wait to get started. Back in his garage, Mark began cleaning out the car. He removed the trash left behind by previous owners, empty soda cans, crumpled receipts, and forgotten trinkets. It was during this cleanup that he noticed something peculiar about the trunk. The carpeted floor seemed uneven, as if hiding something beneath. Intrigued, Mark pulled at the edges until the carpet came loose, revealing a small, rusted compartment he hadn't seen before. Using a screwdriver, he pried the compartment open. Inside, he found a weathered leather-bound diary, a faded photograph, and a small locket. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he examined the photograph. It depicted two young girls, smiling brightly, their arms draped around each other in a carefree embrace. The locket, when opened, contained the initials E and S, engraved in delicate script. Something about the objects felt unsettling, as though they didn't belong there. Curiosity quickly turned into unease as Mark flipped through the diary. The pages were filled with entries written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The author, one of the girls, he assumed, described feelings of fear, desperation, and a sense of being trapped. The entries were dated 40 years ago. Mark's hands trembled as he read passages about being watched, not trusting anyone, and trying to find a way out. Mark decided to dig deeper. He showed the photograph and the diary to his friend Lisa, a local journalist known for her investigative skills. Lisa's eyes widened when she saw the items. "Mark, do you realize what this could be?" she asked. "This could be connected to Emily and Sarah." Emily and Sarah. Their names were etched into the collective memory of Riverbend. The two girls had vanished without a trace 40 years ago, leaving the town in shock and despair. Search parties combed the woods, rivers, and abandoned buildings, but no clues ever surfaced. Over time, the case went cold, and their disappearance became a grim legend, a cautionary tale told to children. Mark and Lisa decided to take the items to the local police. Officer Daniels, who had been a rookie at the time of the girls' disappearance, was now a seasoned veteran. When he saw the photograph, his face paled. "I thought I'd never see this day," he murmured. Daniels retrieved the old case file and compared the photograph to the ones in their records. It was a match. The initials on the locket also corresponded to the girls' names, Emily and Sarah. The discovery breathed new life into the investigation, but it also raised more questions than answers. How did the items end up in the car? Who owned the car 40 years ago? And, most importantly, what happened to the girls? Determined to find answers, Mark and Lisa began tracing the car's history. They learned that it had passed through several hands over the decades, each owner oblivious to its hidden compartment. One name, however, stood out: Walter Briggs, a reclusive man who had lived on the outskirts of town. Walter had sold the car shortly after the girls disappeared and left Riverbend soon after. His sudden departure had raised suspicions at the time, but without evidence, the police couldn't pursue him. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Could Walter have been involved in the girls' disappearance? And if so, was he still alive? As they delved deeper, Mark found himself haunted by the diary's contents. One entry, in particular, stuck with him: "We hear footsteps at night. He's getting angrier. I don't know how much longer we can hide." The words painted a vivid picture of fear and despair, and Mark couldn't shake the image of the girls, scared and alone, desperately hoping for rescue. Despite the growing danger, Mark and Lisa pressed on. They interviewed former neighbors of Walter, searched through old newspaper archives, and even visited the site where Walter's house once stood. The house had long since been demolished, replaced by a strip mall, but locals still whispered about the strange noises they used to hear coming from the property. One evening, while sorting through the diary, Mark noticed something he hadn't seen before. The back cover contained a faint, almost imperceptible map. It appeared to be hand-drawn and marked with an X near the edge of a wooded area on the outskirts of town. Mark's heart raced as he showed it to Lisa. Was this the key to solving the mystery? They decided to follow the map the next day. As Mark lay in bed that night, he couldn't stop thinking about the girls. Who were they really? What had they endured? And what would he find at the end of the trail? The following morning, Mark and Lisa set out for the woods, their nerves tingling with anticipation. The map led them deep into the forest, to a secluded clearing that had been untouched for decades. There, they found the remnants of an old cabin, its walls covered in moss and its roof caved in. As they stepped inside, the air felt heavy, as if the space itself held the weight of untold secrets. Mark's flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing scattered debris and signs of a long-forgotten life. In the corner, he noticed a pile of rotting wood that seemed out of place. As he removed the planks, he uncovered a hidden trapdoor. "Mark, are you sure about this?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "We've come this far," he replied. "We need to know." With great effort, Mark pried open the trapdoor, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading into the earth. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. As they descended, their flashlights illuminated a small, dimly lit room. What they found there would change their lives, and the town of Riverbend, forever. The descent into the narrow staircase was suffocating. The air grew colder with every step Mark and Lisa took, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over them. The flashlight beams trembled in their hands, bouncing off the damp walls of what appeared to be an underground cellar. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint drip of water echoing in the distance. As Mark reached the bottom, his breath caught in his throat. The room was small, no more than 10 feet across, with stone walls slick from years of moisture. Scattered across the floor were remnants of a life frozen in time, an old mattress, tattered blankets, and a small wooden table covered in dust. On the table sat a rusted lantern and a metal plate, its surface stained with age. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. This is where they were kept." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the far corner of the room, where faint carvings covered the wall. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the etchings. They were words, scratched into the stone with desperate hands: "Help us." Below it, another plea: "We're still here." The word sent chills down Mark's spine. The scratches looked deep, raw, and frantic, as if they had been made in a moment of sheer panic. Lisa stepped beside him, her hand trembling as she touched the carvings. They were alive down here. They must have been trying to send a message. Mark's flashlight moved to the floor beneath the carvings. There, he noticed a series of symbols and what appeared to be dates. The markings seemed to count the passing days, tallying up to weeks, then months. They were down here for a long time, he muttered, the weight of the realization almost too much to bear. Lisa pointed to a small object half buried in the dirt. Mark knelt to pick it up, his fingers brushing against the cold, metallic surface. It was another locket, identical to the one he had found in the car, but this one was broken, its clasp hanging loose. Inside was a small, faded photo of Emily and Sarah, their youthful faces now hauntingly familiar. Mark clenched his fist around the locket, his jaw tightening. The injustice of what had happened to these girls was overwhelming. As they continued to search the room, Lisa uncovered a battered notebook tucked beneath the mattress. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. Flipping through it, they found more writing, this time in a different hand than the diary Mark had discovered earlier. The penmanship was rough, almost aggressive, and the entries described the girl's captor in chilling detail. He watches us all the time. He knows when we sleep, when we eat. He gets angry if we talk too much. He keeps the key on his belt. We can hear it jingle when he moves. We've tried to take it, but he always catches us. The entries painted a picture of a man who was not only cruel but methodical. He had kept them here, isolated and terrified, for reasons they could only speculate. Lisa's voice broke the silence. "Walter Briggs," she said softly. "It has to be him. He owned the car, and this property was his before he sold it. He must have brought them here." Mark nodded, but his mind was racing. Something didn't add up. The girls had been kept here, that much was clear, but the diary he had found in the car suggested they had managed to escape at some point. How had the items ended up in the trunk? And if they had escaped, why had no one ever found them? As they searched the room further, Mark noticed a small crack in the wall near the floor. Upon closer inspection, he realized it wasn't a crack at all, but a narrow passageway partially obscured by a loose stone. With some effort, he managed to pull the stone away, revealing a tunnel just wide enough for someone to crawl through. "This might have been their way out," Mark said, shining his flashlight into the dark void. The tunnel stretched into the distance, its endpoint hidden in shadows. Lisa hesitated. "Are you seriously thinking about going in there?" Mark nodded. "If they escaped, this is probably how they did it. We need to know where it leads." Reluctantly, Lisa followed as Mark squeezed into the tunnel. The space was tight, the walls pressing against them as they crawled forward. The air was thick and musty, and the ground was uneven, making progress slow and arduous. Mark's flashlight revealed scratches on the walls, similar to those in the cellar. It was as if the girls had clawed their way through, leaving behind a trail of desperation. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one was larger, with a collapsed ceiling that allowed a sliver of daylight to filter through. The room was empty except for a single wooden box in the center. Mark approached it cautiously, his heart pounding. The box was locked, but the wood was old and brittle. A few strikes with a rock, and the lock gave way. Inside, Mark found a collection of items that made his blood run cold. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing Emily and Sarah in various states of captivity. Some depicted them sitting on the mattress in the cellar, others showed them in the woods, their faces gaunt and hollow. Beneath the photos was a small stack of letters, each addressed to Walter Briggs. The letters, written in elegant handwriting, praised Walter for his dedication and success in maintaining order. One line stood out: "The girls will serve their purpose, as we agreed." Mark and Lisa exchanged horrified glances. This wasn't just the work of one man. There were others involved, others who had enabled and encouraged Walter's actions. The implications were staggering. Before they could process what they had found, the sound of footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind them. Mark and Lisa froze, their flashlights darting toward the entrance. A shadow moved in the darkness, growing larger as it approached. Mark's mind raced. Who could it be? Another investigator? A curious local? Or someone with more sinister intentions? Mark, a voice called out. It was Officer Daniels. Relief washed over them as the veteran policeman emerged from the tunnel, his expression grim. I thought I'd find you here, he said, his flashlight scanning the chamber. When he saw the box and its contents, his face hardened. This just keeps getting worse, Daniels muttered. We need to get this to the station. Now. The three of them made their way back to the surface, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. As they exited the woods, Mark noticed a group of locals gathered near the edge of the property, drawn by the commotion. Whispers spread through the crowd as they saw the photographs and letters. The town's darkest secret was beginning to unravel. Back at the station, the evidence was catalogued and examined in detail. The letters, in particular, were damning, suggesting that Walter had been part of a larger network of individuals involved in the abduction and exploitation of the girls. The photographs were analyzed for clues, revealing landmarks that could potentially lead to more answers. But the most chilling revelation came later that night, when Mark received a call from Lisa. She had been reviewing the diary entries and noticed something they had missed. In one of the final pages, Sarah had written, "We found the car keys. We're going to try tonight. If this is the last thing I write, please remember us." Mark's stomach sank. The diary had been left behind intentionally, a desperate attempt to leave a record of their ordeal. But the girls had clearly made it to the car. What had happened after that? Had they been caught again? Or had they succeeded in escaping, only to meet a different fate? The town of Riverbend was alive with speculation. News of the discovery spread quickly, and the case was reopened with renewed vigor. As investigators combed through the woods and surrounding areas, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something they had yet to uncover. And then came the second twist. A retired officer, who had been involved in the original investigation, came forward with a shocking confession. He revealed that evidence pointing to Walter Briggs had been deliberately suppressed all those years ago. When asked why, the officer hesitated before saying, "I was protecting someone. Someone powerful." The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Who had the officer been protecting? And why had they gone to such lengths to bury the truth? For Mark, the journey was far from over. The evidence they had uncovered raised more questions than answers, and the shadow of what had happened to Emily and Sarah loomed larger than ever. As he sat in his garage that night, staring at the old car that had started it all, Mark made a silent vow. He would find the truth, no matter the cost. Mark sat in his garage, the old car looming in front of him like a ghostly reminder of the horrors he'd uncovered. The questions swirled in his mind, relentless and unyielding. What had truly happened to Emily and Sarah? Who were the powerful people protecting Walter Briggs, and why? He clenched his fists, determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter the risk. The reopening of the case had sent ripples through the small town of Riverbend. For decades, the disappearance of Emily and Sarah had been a source of pain and mystery. Now, with the new evidence surfacing, people were talking, quietly in diners, loudly in bars, and everywhere in between. Old rumors resurfaced, and new theories emerged. Among them was a particularly chilling one, that the girl's disappearance was part of something much larger, something sinister. Mark and Lisa met the following morning to review their next steps. Lisa, her journalist instincts sharp, had spent the night sifting through archives and local records. She had uncovered a disturbing pattern. Over the years, other young girls had gone missing in surrounding towns, their cases similarly unsolved. Some of the disappearances predated Emily and Sarah's vanishing, while others occurred after Walter Briggs had already left town. The timeline painted a grim picture of an ongoing network rather than the actions of a lone predator. "We need to find out who Walter was connected to," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "If he wasn't working alone, there's a chance someone else is still out there." Mark nodded, the tension in his jaw visible. Let's start with the letters we found in that box. Whoever wrote those knew exactly what was happening. The letters had been sent to Walter from an unknown individual, but the handwriting suggested a person of refinement and education. They weren't hastily scrawled notes, they were deliberate, composed messages, laced with chilling phrases like, serve their purpose, and, maintain order. Lisa took the letters to a handwriting analyst she knew from a nearby city, hoping to trace their origin. While Lisa pursued that lead, Mark decided to focus on the car. The vehicle was the key to understanding what had happened during the girls' escape. If Emily and Sarah had reached the car and attempted to flee, it might hold more clues. Mark meticulously examined every inch of it, looking for anything he might have missed during his initial cleaning. He removed the seats, pulled back the carpeting, and even inspected the engine compartment. That's when he found it. Tucked beneath the dashboard, in a space so small it was nearly invisible, Mark discovered a folded piece of paper. It was brittle with age, its edges yellowed and crumbling. Carefully unfolding it, he found what appeared to be a map. Unlike the crude hand-drawn map they had found in the diary, this one was detailed, showing a network of roads and trails leading away from Riverbend and into the neighboring county. On the map, a location had been circled in red. There was no label, just an X marking the spot. Mark's pulse quickened. Was this where Emily and Sarah had been trying to go? Or was it where their captors had intended to take them? Either way, it was a lead he couldn't ignore. He called Lisa, who immediately agreed to join him. Together, they set out in Mark's truck, the map spread across the dashboard. The drive took them deep into the countryside, far from the familiar streets of Riverbend. The roads grew narrower, the landscape more remote. By the time they reached the location marked on the map, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dense woods. The spot turned out to be an old, abandoned barn, its wooden walls weathered and sagging with age. The air around it felt heavy, as if the structure itself carried the weight of forgotten secrets. Mark and Lisa exchanged a glance before stepping inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior of the barn was eerily quiet. Dust particles floated in the beams of light, and the floor creaked under their feet. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the space, just hay bales, rusted tools, and broken equipment. But as they explored further, they noticed something strange, a section of the floor that seemed newer than the rest. The wood was clean and smooth, in stark contrast to the rest of the rotting boards. Mark knelt down and ran his fingers along the edges of the planks. This was replaced recently, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He used a crowbar to pry up the boards, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a metal box, locked and sealed tight. Lisa handed Mark a wrench, and he used it to force the box open. What they found inside made their blood run cold. There were photographs, similar to the ones they had found in the cabin, but these were newer. They showed different girls, young, frightened, and clearly being held against their will. Among the photos was a ledger, its pages filled with names, dates, and numbers. It was a record of transactions, evidence of a human trafficking operation that had been active for decades. Lisa's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. This goes beyond Walter Briggs, she said, her voice cracking. This is organized. There are names here of people who paid for, she couldn't finish the sentence, the weight of it too much to bear. Mark's jaw tightened as he stared at the ledger. Among the names listed were several prominent figures from Riverbend and nearby towns, business owners, politicians, even law enforcement officials. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The powerful people the retired officer had mentioned weren't just protecting Walter, they were complicit. As they processed the gravity of their discovery, the sound of a car engine echoed outside the barn. Mark and Lisa froze, their flashlights clicking off simultaneously. They moved to a corner of the barn, crouching behind a stack of hay bales. Through a crack in the wall, they saw a black SUV pull up, its headlights piercing the darkness. Two men stepped out, their silhouettes tall and imposing. One of them carried a flashlight, sweeping it across the barn's exterior. "They've been here," one of the men said, his voice low and gruff. "The floorboards are open." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. Whoever these men were, they weren't here to help. Mark motioned for her to stay quiet as the men entered the barn, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. One of them cursed under his breath when he saw the open box. "They found the ledger," the man growled. "This is bad. We need to handle this," the other replied. "If they talk, it's over." Mark and Lisa realized they were in grave danger. Slowly, they inched their way toward the back of the barn, where a small door led outside. Mark pushed it open as quietly as he could, motioning for Lisa to go first. The two of them slipped out into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. Once outside, they ran. They didn't stop until they were deep in the woods, far enough away to be sure they hadn't been followed. Mark's mind raced. The men knew someone had found the ledger, which meant they would stop at nothing to silence them. "We have to go to the police," Lisa said, her voice shaking. Mark hesitated. "Can we trust them? What if someone on the inside is involved?" Lisa nodded grimly. "You're right. But we can't keep this to ourselves. We need to find someone we can trust, someone outside of Riverbend if necessary." The drive back to town was tense, every set of headlights on the road sending a jolt of fear through them. Mark knew they were playing a dangerous game, but he also knew they couldn't back down. Too many lives had been destroyed by the operation they had uncovered. It was time to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. By the time they reached Lisa's office, the weight of their discovery had fully sunk in. They had evidence, photographs, the ledger, and the map, but they also had enemies, powerful ones who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate them. Mark clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about Emily and Sarah anymore. It was about justice for all the victims, past and present. As he looked at Lisa, he saw the same determination in her eyes. Together, they made a pact. They would expose the truth, even if it meant putting their lives on the line. Mark and Lisa sat in her small, cluttered office, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them like a physical force. The ledger sat on the desk between them, its pages filled with the names of victims, perpetrators, and transactions that painted a horrifying picture of the network they had stumbled upon. The reality was undeniable. This was more than a single man's crime, it was a systematic, organized operation that had flourished in the shadows for decades. Mark's thoughts were racing. The faces of Emily and Sarah, the two girls who had started this entire journey, flashed before his eyes. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just to them but to every name listed in that ledger. They had to act, but the stakes were high. The men who had come to the barn were proof that this network was still active and dangerous. Lisa broke the silence, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can't keep this here. If they find out we have it, we're as good as dead." Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. "We need to find someone we can trust, someone outside this town, maybe even outside this state." Lisa ran her fingers through her hair, visibly frustrated. "Who, though? The local police could be compromised, and we don't know how far this thing goes. What if it reaches higher levels? What if?" Her words were interrupted by the sharp ring of her office phone. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. Lisa hesitated, then picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Her face paled as she listened to the voice on the other end. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. A moment later, she slammed the phone down, her hands shaking. "What did they say?" Mark asked, his heart pounding. Lisa swallowed hard. "They said, you're digging where you don't belong. Stop now, or we'll stop you." Mark's blood ran cold. The message was clear: they were being watched, and whoever was behind this wouldn't hesitate to silence them. "We need to move," he said firmly. "We can't stay here." Grabbing the ledger and their other evidence, they packed everything into a backpack. Mark insisted on leaving through the back entrance of the office, avoiding the main streets as they made their way to his truck. The streets of Riverbend, usually quiet and welcoming, now felt sinister, every shadow hiding a potential threat. As they drove out of town, Lisa pulled out her phone. "I know someone," she said, her voice steadier now. "An investigative journalist I worked with a few years ago. His name's Alan Cross. He's based in the city, and he's one of the best at exposing corruption. If anyone can help us, it's him." Mark nodded. "Call him." Lisa dialed the number, and after a few rings, a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Alan Cross." "Alan, it's Lisa Myers," she said quickly. "I need your help. It's big, bigger than anything I've ever worked on. I can't explain over the phone, but it's urgent." There was a pause on the other end before Alan replied, "Meet me at my office. Tonight. And be careful." With a destination in mind, they pushed forward, the tension in the truck palpable. The drive to the city was long and nerve-wracking, every passing car or pair of headlights sending jolts of paranoia through them. Mark kept glancing at the rearview mirror, convinced they were being followed. Lisa clutched the backpack tightly, as if it were a lifeline. When they finally reached Alan's office, a modest building in a quieter part of the city, the relief was almost overwhelming. Alan met them at the door, his sharp eyes scanning their faces. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and an air of quiet authority. He ushered them inside quickly, locking the door behind them. "Start from the beginning," Alan said, motioning for them to sit. Mark and Lisa recounted everything, from the discovery of the diary in the car to the photographs, the cabin, the barn, and the ledger. Alan listened intently, his expression darkening with every detail. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, his face grim. "This is huge," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, you've uncovered a trafficking ring that's been operating for decades. The names in this ledger could bring down powerful people, but it also makes you a target." "We already are," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. She recounted the phone call, and Alan's jaw tightened. "You're not safe," he said bluntly. "Whoever's behind this won't hesitate to silence you. They've operated in the shadows for years, and they won't let two people bring them down." Mark leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "What do we do? We can't just sit on this. We have to expose them." Alan nodded. "We will. But we have to be smart about it. First, I'll make copies of the ledger and secure the originals. We need to protect the evidence at all costs. Then, we'll start digging, cross-referencing the names, finding connections, building a case. Once we have enough, we'll take it public." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Alan worked quickly, scanning the pages of the ledger and storing the digital copies on an encrypted drive. He contacted trusted colleagues in the investigative journalism world, people he knew wouldn't be intimidated or bought off. Mark and Lisa assisted where they could, though the weight of their discovery left them both emotionally drained. As the sun began to rise, Alan turned to them. "I'll take it from here," he said. "You two need to lay low. Find somewhere safe and stay off the grid for a while. I'll keep you updated, but don't take any unnecessary risks." Mark hesitated. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly. "This started with me, and I'm seeing it through." Alan studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right. But be careful. They're watching, and they won't hesitate to strike." Mark and Lisa left Alan's office with a mix of hope and fear. They had taken the first step toward justice, but the road ahead was fraught with danger. They decided to stay in a motel on the outskirts of the city, paying in cash and using fake names to avoid detection. That night, as Mark lay awake in the motel room, he couldn't stop thinking about the girls. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just for Emily and Sarah, but for all the victims whose names were in that ledger. He thought about their families, the lives shattered by the actions of this network, and the deep scars left behind. The next morning, Lisa received a call from Alan. "We've got a lead," he said. "One of the names in the ledger matches a high-profile businessman in the city, a man named Richard Calloway. He's been untouchable for years, but we've found financial transactions that tie him to Walter Briggs. If we can link him to the operation, it could blow this thing wide open." Mark and Lisa met Alan at his office, where he presented the evidence he'd uncovered. Calloway had made several large, untraceable payments to an offshore account tied to Briggs. In addition, there were records of private meetings between the two men, as well as witness statements that suggested Calloway had frequented properties associated with the trafficking ring. "This is it," Alan said. "This is the connection we need. If we can expose Calloway, it'll unravel the entire operation." But as they planned their next steps, an ominous warning arrived. A brick was thrown through Alan's office window, shattering the glass. Attached to it was a note, "Drop this, or you'll regret it." Mark picked up the note, his anger boiling over. "They think they can scare us into silence," he said, his voice low and steady. "But they've underestimated us." Alan's expression was equally resolute. "This changes nothing. If anything, it proves we're getting closer to the truth." As they prepared to confront the powerful forces behind the trafficking ring, Mark knew there was no turning back. The fight for justice was just beginning, and he was determined to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The brick through the window was not just a warning, it was a declaration of war. The people behind the trafficking ring had made it clear they were willing to escalate, and Mark, Lisa, and Alan knew they were walking a razor-thin line between uncovering the truth and putting their lives in jeopardy. Despite the danger, their resolve only hardened. They were up against powerful individuals who had operated with impunity for decades, and it was time to bring them down. Mark leaned against the shattered window in Alan's office, staring out at the quiet street below. "They think this will scare us," he said, his voice low but steady. "But all it does is prove we're on the right track." Alan nodded, gathering the shards of glass into a small pile. "It means we've hit a nerve. They know we're close, and they're panicking." Lisa, seated at the desk with the ledger open before her, glanced up. "We have to move quickly. Every minute we wait gives them more time to cover their tracks." The trio decided to focus their efforts on Richard Calloway, the high-profile businessman whose name and financial records tied him to the trafficking operation. Calloway was a pillar of the community, wealthy, influential, and well-connected. To the public, he was a philanthropist who donated generously to charities and funded local initiatives. But the evidence they had uncovered painted a far darker picture, one of a man who had profited from human suffering and built his empire on the backs of countless victims. Alan's team of trusted journalists began digging into Calloway's background, uncovering a trail of suspicious transactions and unexplained wealth. Meanwhile, Mark and Lisa worked to connect the dots between Calloway and Walter Briggs. They reviewed every piece of evidence they had, looking for anything that could strengthen their case. Late one night, as Mark pored over the photographs they had found in the barn, something caught his eye. In one of the images, Emily and Sarah were standing in a room with a distinctive pattern of wallpaper, a pattern that seemed oddly familiar. He rummaged through the other photos, searching for more images of the same room. When he found them, he noticed a small detail in the background, a clock with the name, Calloway Manor, etched into its face. Mark's heart raced as he turned to Lisa. "Look at this," he said, holding up the photos. "That wallpaper, that clock, these pictures were taken in Calloway's estate." Lisa's eyes widened as she studied the images. "That's the proof we need. It ties him directly to the girls. Alan, who had been working at his desk, walked over and examined the photos. "This changes everything," he said. "If these were taken in Calloway's home, it's irrefutable evidence that he was involved. But getting that evidence into the right hands would be no small feat. They couldn't trust the local authorities, many of whom were likely compromised. And going public without concrete proof could backfire, putting them in even greater danger. They needed a plan, one that would expose Calloway and his network while protecting themselves." Alan reached out to a federal contact he trusted, an agent named Karen Reynolds who specialized in human trafficking cases. She agreed to meet them in a secure location to review the evidence and discuss the next steps. The meeting was set for the following evening in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. When they arrived at the cafe, Karen was already waiting for them. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with years of experience and a reputation for taking down powerful criminals. Alan introduced her to Mark and Lisa, and they wasted no time diving into the details of the case. Karen examined the photos, the ledger, and the letters they had found. Her expression grew darker with each piece of evidence. "This is enough to launch an investigation," she said. "But we have to be careful. People like Calloway don't go down without a fight. If we make a move too soon, he'll bury this operation and disappear." Mark leaned forward, his fists clenched. "We can't let that happen. There are people who have suffered for years because of him. We need to make sure he pays." Karen nodded. "And we will. But we need to build an airtight case. That means finding more evidence, more witnesses, anything that can corroborate what we already have." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Karen brought in a team of federal agents to assist with the investigation, working discreetly to avoid tipping off Calloway or his associates. Mark and Lisa continued their own efforts, determined to uncover every piece of the puzzle. Their breakthrough came when Lisa tracked down a woman named Maria, who had been listed in the ledger as one of the victims. Maria had managed to escape the trafficking ring years ago and was now living under a different name in a nearby city. At first, she was hesitant to talk, afraid of the repercussions. But when Lisa showed her the evidence they had gathered, including the photos of Emily and Sarah, Maria broke down in tears. "They were just kids," Maria said, her voice shaking. "They didn't deserve any of this." Through her tears, Maria recounted her harrowing experience, describing how she had been taken, held captive, and forced into the ring. She confirmed that Calloway had been a key figure, often visiting the properties where the victims were kept and overseeing the operation. Maria's testimony was a game-changer. With her account, the photographs, the ledger, and the financial records, they had a case strong enough to take to court. But they knew that exposing Calloway would be dangerous. He had resources, connections, and a history of silencing those who opposed him. Karen devised a plan to arrest Calloway and raid his properties simultaneously, ensuring he couldn't destroy evidence or escape. The operation was set for dawn, with teams of federal agents prepared to move in. Mark and Lisa were advised to stay out of the action for their own safety, but Mark insisted on being involved. "These girls deserve justice," he said firmly. "I can't just sit on the sidelines." Karen reluctantly agreed, assigning him a role as a witness liaison to ensure his safety during the operation. The morning of the raid was tense. Mark, Lisa, and Alan waited anxiously at the Federal Command Center, watching as agents moved into position. The first team breached Calloway's mansion, their movements swift and precise. Within minutes, they had Calloway in custody, along with several of his associates. Other teams raided properties linked to the trafficking ring, uncovering more evidence and rescuing several victims who were still being held captive. When the operation concluded, Karen returned to the command center with a satisfied smile. "It's over," she said. "We got him." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tempered by the weight of everything they had uncovered. The fight wasn't over, not for the victims who would spend the rest of their lives dealing with the trauma, nor for the families of those who had been lost. But it was a step toward justice, a step toward healing. In the days that followed, the story made headlines across the country. Calloway's arrest and the dismantling of the trafficking ring sent shockwaves through the community. Mark and Lisa were hailed as heroes, though they shied away from the spotlight, preferring to focus on helping the survivors. For Mark, the journey had been life-changing. What had started as a simple car purchase had turned into a battle against unimaginable darkness. As he stood in his garage, staring at the old sedan that had set everything in motion, he felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of responsibility. "Justice doesn't stop here," he said to Lisa, who stood beside him. "There are more people out there, more victims who need help. We can't let this be the end." Lisa nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Then let's keep going. Together." And so, what began as a quest for answers became a mission for justice, one that would continue to transform their lives, and the lives of countless others, for years to come. The aftermath of the operation was a mix of relief, chaos, and reflection. With Richard Calloway and his network exposed, Riverbend and the surrounding communities were left grappling with the revelations. The media swarmed the town, reporters eager to dig deeper into the story of the human trafficking ring that had thrived in their midst for decades. For Mark and Lisa, it was a time of reckoning, a chance to reflect on what they had uncovered and what it all meant. Mark found himself spending long hours in his garage, the old sedan now sitting as a stark reminder of the events that had unfolded. It wasn't just a car anymore, it was a symbol of the courage it took to face the truth and the responsibility they now carried. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily and Sarah, their faces, their story, their suffering. Though they hadn't found the girls alive, their voices had not been silenced. Through the evidence, the diary, and the photographs, their story had become a catalyst for justice. Lisa, meanwhile, threw herself into ensuring that the voices of the victims were not lost in the noise of the scandal. With Alan's help, she began writing a series of in-depth articles about the trafficking ring, its victims, and the systemic failures that had allowed it to persist. Her articles focused not just on the perpetrators but on the survivors, giving them a platform to share their experiences and reclaim their narratives. One of the most poignant moments came when Maria, the survivor who had provided critical testimony, decided to speak publicly. With Lisa's support, Maria gave a televised interview, her face partially obscured to protect her identity. Her voice trembled but was steady as she recounted her ordeal and the strength it had taken to rebuild her life. "I thought I was forgotten," Maria said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But now I know there are people who care. People who will fight for us. And I want to thank them, for giving us hope." Maria's words resonated across the nation, sparking a wave of support for anti-trafficking initiatives. Donations poured into organizations dedicated to helping survivors, and community groups formed to ensure vigilance against such crimes in the future. But the road to healing was not without its challenges. The revelations had torn Riverbend apart, exposing deep fractures in the community. Several prominent figures were implicated in the scandal, including a respected police officer, a local business owner, and even a clergyman. Their arrests shocked the town, leaving many to question how such atrocities could have been hidden for so long. The fallout was particularly difficult for the families of Emily and Sarah. The discovery of their fate brought a bittersweet closure to the decades-long mystery. Their remains were found buried in a remote area linked to Calloway's estate, and the evidence suggested they had died shortly after their escape attempt. Though their families were heartbroken, they expressed gratitude to Mark and Lisa for uncovering the truth. "They gave us what we never thought we'd have, answers," Sarah's mother said during a vigil held in the girl's memory. The vigil, attended by hundreds, was a somber yet powerful event. Candles lit the night as the community came together to honor the lives of Emily and Sarah and to vow that such horrors would never be allowed to happen again. For Mark, the vigil was a turning point. As he stood among the crowd, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the faces around him, he realized how much had changed. He had started this journey as an ordinary mechanic, a man with no experience in solving mysteries or fighting injustice. But the events had transformed him, revealing a strength and determination he hadn't known he possessed. The next morning, Mark met with Lisa and Alan to discuss what came next. With Calloway's arrest, the trafficking ring had been dealt a significant blow, but they knew the fight wasn't over. The ledger they had found contained names and transactions that pointed to a much larger network, one that extended far beyond Riverbend. "We can't stop now," Lisa said, her voice firm. "There are more people involved, more victims out there. We've started something, but it's far from finished." Alan agreed. "This is just the tip of the iceberg. If we want to dismantle this network, we need to keep digging, and we'll need resources." Mark listened, his mind racing. He had never considered himself an activist or a crusader for justice, but the thought of walking away from the fight felt impossible. Too many lives were at stake, and he couldn't ignore the responsibility he felt. "I'm in," Mark said finally. "Whatever it takes, I'm with you." Together, the trio began laying the groundwork for their next steps. Alan reached out to his network of journalists and investigators, while Lisa began researching grants and funding opportunities for anti-trafficking efforts. Mark, determined to contribute in his own way, started organizing community meetings to raise awareness about trafficking and how to recognize the signs. The meetings were an eye-opener for many in the town. Survivors shared their stories, law enforcement officials provided training, and organizations offered resources for prevention and support. Mark was particularly struck by the response from younger generations, who showed a willingness to engage and take action. One evening, after a particularly powerful meeting, Mark returned home to find a letter waiting for him. It was from Sarah's younger sister, now a grown woman. She had been just a toddler when Sarah disappeared, too young to remember her sister but old enough to feel the void her absence had left. In the letter, she wrote, "Thank you for giving my sister a voice. For so long, we felt forgotten, like no one cared about what happened to her and Emily. But you cared. You fought for them, and you gave us answers. You've made us believe in justice again." The letter brought tears to Mark's eyes. It was a reminder of why he had taken this journey and why he couldn't stop now. Emily and Sarah's story was tragic, but it had also become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of seeking the truth. As the weeks turned into months, Mark, Lisa, and Alan continued their work. Their efforts expanded beyond Riverbend, reaching into neighboring towns and cities. They collaborated with law enforcement, advocacy groups, and survivors to create a comprehensive approach to combating trafficking. The journey wasn't easy. They faced setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But they also witnessed incredible acts of courage and resilience, from survivors who shared their stories to communities that rallied together to protect their most vulnerable members. For Mark, the transformation was profound. He was no longer just a man who had stumbled upon a mystery, he was a fighter, a leader, and an advocate. The old car in his garage, once a relic of a forgotten past, had become a symbol of everything they had achieved, and everything they still hoped to accomplish. 1 year after Calloway's arrest, Mark stood on a stage in front of a packed auditorium, addressing a crowd that had gathered for a fundraiser to support trafficking survivors. He spoke about Emily and Sarah, about the courage it took to seek the truth, and about the importance of never turning a blind eye to injustice. "Emily and Sarah's story taught me that even ordinary people can make a difference," he said, his voice steady. "We may not be able to change the past, but we can fight for a better future, one where no one has to endure what they did." As the crowd erupted into applause, Mark felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. And while the fight was far from over, he knew one thing for certain: he would never stop fighting for justice.